Before the sky caught fire on Mars, the spark of annihilation was struck in the dark, heavy atmosphere of a neighboring world, Maldek. It was a planet of immense, crushing gravity, both physical and political. While the Martians built their cities of stone and blue energy, the inhabitants of Maldek built fortresses of jagged black steel and dark crimson power. They were a proud, ancient, and deeply militaristic species, the undisputed apex predators of the sector. For countless millennia, they had looked out into the void and seen nothing but their own reflection. They were the masters of the long dark. But a new, chaotic variable had emerged in their perfect equation, the humanoids on the fourth rock from the sun. Inside the High Command Center, buried deep beneath the black metallic crust of the capital, the political elite of Maldek stood around a massive, glowing, crimson holographic map of the solar system. They were furious. The red lines of Martian commercial and military expansion were creeping outward, stretching their supply lines, securing resources, and establishing outposts. To the political leaders, this was not just competition. It was an insult. It was an intolerable, festering threat to Maldek's absolute dominance. The humanoids were expanding too fast, breeding too quickly, and demanding a seat at a table that Maldek had owned since the dawn of history. At the head of the table stood Admiral Vrax. He was a purebred commander of the High Fleet, a towering, imposing figure in immaculate dark military regalia. His features were sharp, his jawline defined by the fine, dark, iridescent scales of the elite warrior caste. He listened to the politicians screaming about trade routes and resource deficits with cold, unblinking disdain. The politicians were cowards who fought with ledgers. Vrax fought with plasma. He didn't care about Martian commerce. He cared about power. Standing silently in the shadows behind the admiral was Vess. She was breathtaking. She did not possess the heavy, brutalist features of the military caste. Her form was soft, alluring, and flawlessly feminine, her skin woven with fine, smooth, iridescent scales that shimmered beautifully in the dim crimson light. She wore sleek, form-fitting dark silk that perfectly traced the elegant, sweeping curves of her body. To the politicians, she was merely the admiral's beautiful consort, a prize point blank. But Vrax knew the truth. Vess was one of the most brilliant strategic minds on the planet, and unlike the arrogant men screaming in the war room, she had actually spent time living among the humanoids on Mars. The Supreme Chancellor slammed his heavy fist onto the edge of the holographic table, shattering the silence. "The time for observation is over, Admiral." The Chancellor barked, his voice a harsh, guttural rasp. "The humanoids are establishing a heavy munitions grid on their northern ridge. If we allow them to solidify that perimeter, they will hold the entire inner sector hostage. The Council demands a decisive, absolute military operation. We strike now. We break their back before they can stand." Admiral Vrax did not flinch. He slowly crossed his heavy arms over his chest, a cold, arrogant smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. "The humanoids are insects. Chancellor, they build walls of stone because they are afraid of the dark. My Crescent fleet can burn their entire perimeter to glass in a single solar cycle. If the Council authorizes the strike, I will not just break their back. I will erase their sky." The Council roared its approval, the heavy metal doors of the war room sliding open as the politicians rushed out to finalize the war decrees. The room emptied, leaving only the Admiral and Vess alone in the glow of the red hologram. Vess stepped out of the shadows, the soft rustle of her silk echoing in the quiet room. She did not look triumphant. She looked terrified. She reached out, her delicate, iridescent fingers resting gently on the dark fabric of the Admiral's uniform. "Vrax," she whispered, her voice a soft, beautiful melody that commanded his immediate attention. "You must listen to me. The Council is blind, but you cannot afford to be. Do not launch the Crescent fleet." Vrax looked down at her delicate hand resting against his chest, and then up into her dark, captivating eyes. He let out a low, rumbling laugh that vibrated deep in his chest. "Are you afraid of the humanoids, Vess? The creatures who dig in the dirt?" He reached up, his large, clawed hand gently stroking the side of her face, tracing the smooth, shimmering scales along her jawline. "They are soft. They have no natural armor, no deep history of conquest. They are children playing at war." Vess pulled his hand away, her grip surprisingly strong. She stepped closer to him, closing the distance until she was looking directly up into his eyes. "You don't understand them," she pleaded. the desperation in her voice cutting through the quiet of the war room. I lived among them. Vrax, I watched them build those cities. They are not like us. We calculate, we measure risk and reward. If a battle is lost, we retreat. We survive. But the humanoids, they are driven by something completely irrational. She turned and pointed to the glowing red projection of the Martian planet hovering between them. They are driven by emotion, by attachment, by an absolute terrifying stubbornness. They are extreme risk-takers. If you back them into a corner, if you threaten the things they love, they will not surrender. They will not calculate the odds of victory. They will risk everything. They will risk total mutual destruction just to ensure you do not win. Vrax sighed, turning his back on her. He walked slowly toward the massive, reinforced viewport at the far end of the room. Outside, suspended in the dark, heavy atmosphere of Maldek, was his armada. Hundreds of colossal, crescent-shaped warships hung in the sky, their weapons arrays glowing with a dull, terrifying red heat. It was the greatest assembly of military power the sector had ever seen. The sheer, overwhelming, destructive capability of the fleet was intoxicating. It was absolute. You have spent too much time among the soft things, my love, Vrax said, his voice echoing off the glass. You have let their weakness infect your logic. They can be as stubborn as they wish. A stubborn insect still burns when you apply the plasma. He turned back to face her, his expression hardening into the cold, ruthless mask of the Supreme Commander. The politicians are right about one thing. The humanoids are a plague, and tomorrow I am going to sterilize the fourth planet. Vess stood perfectly still by the holographic table. She knew it was over. The hubris of the military caste was a gravity well she could not pull him out of. She had seen the Martian engineers. She had seen the heavy, desperate, frantic energy with which they built their defensive grids. They knew Maldek was watching, and she knew, with an absolute, chilling certainty, that the humanoids had not just built shields, they had built a spear. You are going to kill us all, Vrax, she whispered to the empty room as the heavy vault doors slammed shut behind him. The launch of the Crescent Fleet was a spectacle of terrifying beauty. Millions of tons of black, jagged steel ripped through the heavy atmosphere of Maldek, leaving trails of burning red plasma in their wake. They moved with the cold, synchronized precision of a predator closing in on its prey. To the citizens of Maldek watching from the surface, it was a display of ultimate, unquestionable supremacy. The war was already won in their minds. The fleet was merely traveling to deliver the execution order. On the bridge of the flagship dreadnought, the silence was absolute. The massive room was bathed in the harsh, crimson glow of the tactical screens. Admiral Vrax stood at the helm, his heavy hands clasped behind his back, his eyes locked on the expanding blue sphere of the Martian homeworld in the distance. He felt no anxiety. He felt no doubt. He felt only the cold, mechanical anticipation of the strike. Vess stood quietly in the background, her arms wrapped around herself. The sleek silk of her clothing seemed inadequate against the sudden, freezing chill she felt settling over the bridge. She watched the blue planet growing larger in the viewport, her heart pounding with a slow, sickening dread. The fleet crossed the void and entered the Martian atmosphere without breaking formation. The humanoids' perimeter alarms screamed, but it was too late. The Crescent ships did not bother to secure the orbit or demand surrender. They simply opened fire. Massive, searing beams of red-orange plasma rained down from the heavens, striking the sprawling cities below. The heavy stone and reinforced steel of the Martian towers vaporized instantly, reduced to ash in the blink of an eye. The destruction was absolute. It was exactly as Vrax had promised. He was erasing their sky. On the bridge, the tactical officers reported the casualty numbers with cold, mechanical efficiency. Millions dead in the first strike. The primary energy grids were collapsing. The capital city was entirely gone. Vrax smiled, a cold, triumphant expression settling over his sharp features. He turned slightly, looking back over his shoulder at Vess. "You see," he said softly, "the insects burn. There will be no mutual destruction today. But Vess was not looking out the viewport. She was staring at a secondary tactical screen in the far corner of the bridge, her beautiful face drained of all color. While the primary screens tracked the destruction of the cities, this screen was tied to the deep space telemetry arrays left behind in Maldek's orbit. A single, massive energy spike had just registered. It didn't come from the Martian perimeter defenses. It came from a deep subterranean silo, miles beneath the burning surface. It wasn't a defensive weapon. It wasn't designed to shoot down the Crescent ships or protect the dying cities. It was a single, massive, experimental kinetic spear. It rocketed out of the hidden subterranean silo, tearing through the burning atmosphere so fast it bypassed the Maldec blockade entirely. It didn't aim for the fleet. It aimed for the void. Vess ran forward, the soft silk of her robe snapping around her legs. She shoved past a tactical officer and grabbed the edge of the central holographic table. "Vrax!" she screamed, her voice cracking with terror. "Look at the telemetry! Look at the trajectory!" The Admiral turned, his triumphant smile fading into an expression of profound annoyance. He looked down at the hologram. A single, glowing red line was streaking across the solar system, moving at a speed that defied the laws of known physics. It was completely ignoring the battle. It was heading straight for their home world. "It's a stray," Vrax dismissed, waving his heavy hand, "a desperate, blind shot into the dark. It will burn up in the outer atmosphere of Maldek." "It's not a stray!" Vess screamed, tears of absolute panic welling in her dark eyes. She tapped the console, zooming in on the target coordinates. "It's not aiming for a city. It's aiming for the primary core, the planetary nuclear stockpile. Vrax, if that kinetic mass hits the core at that velocity, it won't just detonate the stockpile. It will crack the tectonic plates. It will ignite the mantle." She looked up at him, the horrifying reality of what the humanoids had done finally settling over her like a shroud. The Martians knew they couldn't win the orbital war. They knew their cities would burn. So they had calculated the absolute maximum amount of pain they could inflict in return. Vess gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the man she loved, the man who had just doomed their entire species. "I told you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I told you they were extreme risk-takers. They are willing to kill us all." Vrax stared at the hologram. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of doubt crossed his sharp features. But the hubris of the apex predator was too deeply ingrained. He could not accept that the insects had outmaneuvered him. He slammed his fist onto the console. "Nonsense, woman!" Vrax roared, his voice echoing over the bridge. "Those humanoids cannot defeat us. The planetary shields will hold." The planetary shields did not hold. The Martian spear hit the surface of Maldek with the kinetic force of a small moon. It punched through the heavy atmospheric crust, bypassed the automated defense grids, and buried itself deep into the primary nuclear stockpile buried within the planet's mantle. The explosion was utterly silent in the vacuum of space, but the visual violence was absolute. Maldek didn't just burn, it shattered. A blinding, terrifying flash of pure white light erupted from the core, followed immediately by a massive, expanding wave of crimson fire. The entire planet, billions of years of history, the towering black cities, the ancient vaults, and billions of souls were vaporized in a fraction of a second. The sheer kinetic force of the explosion sent a silent, rippling shockwave through the very fabric of space. Maldek was gone. In its place was a violently expanding cloud of planetary debris, massive chunks of superheated rock and molten core hurtling outward into the void. On the bridge of the flagship, the blinding white light of their murdered home world flooded through the viewport, instantly maxing out the visual dampeners. Vrax threw his arms over his face just as the shockwave hit the fleet. The massive dreadnought was violently tossed like a toy in a hurricane. Warning sirens screamed as the black metal hull buckled under the immense kinetic pressure. Consoles exploded in showers of lethal sparks. Officers were thrown to the deck, crushed by falling debris as the gravity plating failed. The hubris vanished, replaced instantly by the raw animal instinct to survive. Vrax lunged across the tilting, sparking deck. He grabbed Vess by the waist, pulling her violently against his chest and throwing them both beneath the heavy structural arch of the primary bulkhead, just as the ceiling collapsed in a shower of twisted steel and sparking cables. He wrapped his massive, heavily scaled arms completely around her, shielding her fragile body from the destruction of his own ship. The mighty commander of the High Fleet was reduced to a desperate, cornered animal, clinging to the only thing he had left in the universe. The violent shaking eventually stopped, replaced by the ominous, groaning creak of stressed metal and the hiss of leaking oxygen lines. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, bloody shadows across the ruined bridge. The dreadnought had survived the shockwave, but it was critically, perhaps fatally, damaged. Vrax pushed the heavy steel debris off his back with a guttural grunt, pulling Vess up from the floor. She was trembling violently, her beautiful silk robes torn and covered in soot, but she was alive. They walked slowly, unsteadily, toward the massive cracked viewport at the front of the bridge. They looked out into the void, where their home had been, where the heavy, dark planet of Maldec had dominated the night sky. There was nothing but a massive, slowly expanding ring of molten rocks, flaming debris, and dust. An asteroid belt born from the corpse of their civilization. The greatest military power in the sector had been utterly erased. Vess stood perfectly still, her hands resting against the cracked glass. Tears streamed silently down her face, cutting clean tracks through the soot on her shimmering scales. She didn't say, "I told you so." There was no victory in being right. There was only the crushing, infinite emptiness of total extinction. She looked at the glowing embers of her home, her mind unable to process the scale of the slaughter. Her species, her history, her entire world was gone. Vrax stood beside her. He looked at the asteroid belt, the grave of his arrogant pride. For a long moment, the Supreme Commander felt the terrifying weight of his failure. He had underestimated the humanoids. He had pushed them into a corner, and they had bitten the hand that squeezed them, poisoning the entire body. But the grief did not last. In the mind of the apex predator, grief is a useless emotion. It was rapidly, violently consumed by a cold-blooded, absolute hatred. He turned to Vess. He reached out, his heavy, clawed hand surprisingly gentle as he wiped a tear from her cheek. He didn't offer apologies. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He offered the only thing a military commander knows how to give. He offered a target. "What do we do now, Vrax?" Vess whispered, her voice hollow. "We are ghosts. We have nowhere to go." Vrax looked past the burning ruins of Mars, his eyes fixing on a distant, small, blue-green sphere hanging in the dark closer to the sun. "We will resettle," he said, his voice a low, terrifying promise that echoed through the ruined bridge. "There is another planet nearby, a primitive world. It will take time to conquer the beasts that roam its surface, but we will make it ours." He placed his hand on the cracked glass, staring at the distant Earth. "And when the humanoids eventually follow us there, we will not try to destroy them. We will enslave them. We will wrap their minds in a quarantine so deep they will forget they ever touched the stars. They will never, ever threaten us again." The story you just heard is fiction, but the war was real. The exploding planet of Maldec, the creation of the asteroid belt, the clashing extraterrestrial armadas, and the subsequent enslavement and psychic quarantine of Earth are hidden in ancient religious texts, suppressed histories, and global mythology. We know because we looked. Discover the actual, blind remote viewing data that uncovered the true war in heaven, and learn the real history of humanity's ancient past. See the evidence. Visit farsightprime.com.